The Oslo process is often presented as a framework for a two-state settlement that failed. I think that's a misinterpretation of the 1993 Oslo Accords. The accord itself is 3 pages in length. It's largely written in plain English with very little technical language. It never speaks about a two-state settlement as a preferred or even any outcome. The words occupation, self-determination, statehood, for example, are nowhere to be found. And so my interpretation is that in the aftermath of the huge changes in both the region and globally as a result of the First Intifada, the Kuwait crisis, the end of the Cold War, and the collapse of the Soviet Union, Israel came to a realization that the status quo was untenable. And the Oslo Accord was its way of reformulating its relationship with the Palestinians in a way that would, on the one hand, consolidate Israeli control over those areas of the occupied territories it wanted to permanently incorporate into Israel, and at the same time bringing in its former adversary, the PLO, as a partner in this process. Secondly, even if you want to approach it as an agreement that was perhaps flawed, but had the real capacity to result in an implementation of what was then the international consensus on a resolution of the question of Palestine, which is essentially an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 boundaries, establishment of a Palestinian state with mutual recognition between the Arab states and Israel, and a just resolution of the refugee question. The only framework of reference that the Oslo agreements provide for what it terms the permanent status or final status of this issue is a single reference to UN Security Council resolutions 242 and 338. Now, many people might look at this and say, well, isn't that exactly what should be the outcome of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations? Well, yes, but because the problem is that Israel, on the one hand, largely supported by the United States, and the Palestinians and the rest of the world, on the other hand, have diametrically opposed interpretations of what those resolutions mean. To the world, it means an Israeli withdrawal to the 1967 boundaries and the just resolution of the refugee question. Israel maintains that the absence of the definite article before occupied territories in the English version of Resolution 242 means that it's not obligated to withdraw to the 1967 boundaries. And it furthermore maintains that in the context of the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement of 1979, in which it relinquished its occupation over the entirety of the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula, it has already withdrawn from the vast majority of territories it occupied in 1967, and therefore has already essentially fulfilled the requirements of resolutions 242 and 338. Thirdly, well, you might say, okay, parties involved in negotiations always disagree. That's ultimately why they need to negotiate. So then let's look at the arbitration mechanisms. Well, there are no binding arbitration mechanisms in the Oslo Accords. In fact, the only arbitration mechanisms are ones which Israel consents to. In other words, so long as Israel is to withhold its consent for arbitration of disputes between the Israeli and Palestinian parties, whether about negotiations or implementation or anything else, there will be no arbitration. So that was another fundamental flaw. And finally, and I would argue, despite me bringing it up last, it's a key issue that needs to be taken into account, is that the Oslo process was not an international process. Rather, it was a bilateral process in which Israel and the Palestinians, in contrast to virtually every other instance of decolonization that we've seen since 1945, where the occupier basically comes to the conclusion that the perpetuation of its occupation is no longer tenable, and then negotiates with representatives of the occupied about mechanisms to terminate the occupation and establish a modus vivendi or peace or whatever. The Oslo process was a bilateral agreement in which the status of the occupied territories was basically transformed within the context of this agreement from occupied territories, which is how they are classified under international law and by international consensus, into disputed territories in which Palestinian rights and Israeli claims were considered equally valid. And on top of that, rather than this being a negotiating process held under multilateral or international auspices, it was in effect a process that was conducted under the auspices, the virtually exclusive auspices of the United States. And the role played by the United States as one of the key American participants in this process, Aaron David Miller, put it so accurately in an opinion piece in the Washington Post about 20 years ago, was that it functioned not as an honest broker or even a dishonest broker, but as, in his words, Israel's lawyer. So you had, in effect, where the vast disparity between Israel and the Palestinians was amplified by the custodian of a process who, on the one hand, considered the more powerful party, Israel, a key strategic ally, and considered the weaker party, the PLO, a terrorist organization on probation. You can have an argument about whether Israeli actions or Palestinian actions were consistent with the Oslo framework or violations of them. I think the more important point to make here is that Israel was never confronted with meaningful consequences, in fact, any consequences, for its actions on the ground during the 1990s. The attitude of the West, of the United States and the European Union, was that the process was sacred, the process needed to be kept alive at any cost, and that cost was usually ignoring developments on the ground in the service of this chimera that was known as the peace process. And the predictable results, of course, was that the conditions on the ground to actually implement the international consensus became more and more distant with each passing year.